Welcome back. Today we're moving forward and talking about the Korean War. Again, to review, my name is Second Lieutenant Flood, talking about your world history series. So, the Korean War is going to be born out of the end of World War II. When it comes to the Korean War, think about what we talked about at the end of the last presentation. What major conflict is now on the horizon? That is the Cold War. So, why do you think this next big conflict is called the Cold War? One of the things you might think of is cold, so maybe it was fought in the cold. That's true, some of it was, but actually it's called the Cold War because it's a conflict that never really heated up, I guess you could say, using that same thought line. Instead, it was something that lingered on throughout the 80s and even into the early 90s, from the point of the end of World War II. And between those 2 points, the end of World War II up through the early 90s, there was a lot of smaller conflicts that made up the Cold War. And the first one that we're going to be talking about is the Korean War. When it comes to the Korean War, we need some background information. So after any big conflict, there's a territory and it has people who have been defeated. Who gets to control those territories? The answer to that question is the ones who were victorious. So the Allied powers being victorious, they got to decide which country is going to be ruling over those new acquired territories. As I mentioned in the last video, the Soviet Union was dramatically different from the US, Britain, and France in that they were communist, and these other countries were democratic. And so a major point of contention came when a territory could not be decided if it was going to be communist or democratic. And for that reason, there was often conflict. And one of these territories was called Korea, the Korean Peninsula. So again, World War II comes to a close. The Allies are sitting down and saying, okay, the Korean Peninsula, who's going to control that territory? We want it to be democratic. The Soviets say, actually, we want it to be communist. What's the natural way to compromise? You split things in two. That's what happened. The North becomes communist, and the South becomes democratic. So we have a democratic South right up against a communist North. Everything should work out fine, right? Definitely not. Why do you think there's a natural conflict waiting to happen when you divide a once united people across a line and say, you're this government and you're that government? Why might that cause conflict? The answer might be because inevitably there's now rivalry. Which side is better? We're different. Even though we're the same people, we may have been one culture. You're now this and I'm that. So this is going to be causing a conflict. Okay. Another thing that's important to note about the Cold War is that both sides obviously had a vested interest. If the North had invaded the South and taken over the whole peninsula and Korea became one communist country, would the Soviet Union be mad? Definitely not. If the South had, for some reason, decided to take on the North and create one democratic country, would the other democratic allies be mad? Probably not too much. So both sides, not just the countries involved, not just North and South Korea, but the bigger powers that created the situation have a very vested interest in this conflict. So let's get started. This whole conflict, the Korean War, occurs when North Korea invades South Korea. So the North invades the South in hopes of creating, like I mentioned earlier, one communist state. On June 25th of 1950, this invasion by the North takes place. When it comes to this conflict, there's also a lot of Iowans that were involved. A couple of important units to mention would be the 132nd Fighter Wing, based out of Des Moines and Sioux City. They were mustered into federal service on April 1st, 1951. Other notable units to mention from the state of Iowa would be the 232nd Air Service Group at Des Moines and Sioux City, 3657th Ordnance Company out of Cedar Rapids, and the 194th Field Artillery Battalion out of Spencer, Algona, Humboldt, Mapleton, and Estherville. So, notable Iowans to mention for this conflict. Let's get back to what was actually happening within this war. So effectively what we have going on is we see, like I mentioned earlier, the North invading the South, and then the South, with the help of the Americans, fighting and pushing the North back to the Chinese border. So if we were to take a look at a map, you would see the Korean Peninsula, and then to the north of that Korean Peninsula, you have the Chinese mainland. The Chinese mainland was important in that their form of government was similar to a power that was in this conflict. Can anyone guess what form of government that is? Here's a clue. It's the same form of government that China still has today. Communist. So the communist regime of China recognized, hey, we have a communist power to the south of us that's in trouble. We're going to help to push them back down. So once the US and South Korea pushed up to Chinese border, China got involved and helped to the North Koreans push the US and South Korea back to that original dividing point. So after China got involved, the war moved down to what's called the 38th parallel. So if you take a look at a map with lines of latitude, lines of longitude, along that 38th parallel, that's where the conflict really came to a halt. And what's interesting to note about this is that the war between North and South Korea never really ended. They had a ceasefire. So once the ceasefire took place, there was no more fighting, but there was never a treaty. That's the key word there. A treaty would have signaled an end to the war. Both sides did not want to admit defeat. Both sides did not want to really fight again. So instead they had a ceasefire. So technically, if we were to think of it in terms of words actually meaning something, the Korean War is still going on today. A ceasefire is only in place. And the lines dividing North and South Korea are along that 38th parallel. Before we close out this conflict, this is an important thing in that there's been a lot of current events that have been going around this conflict. Think back to the last 4 years. What have been some notable events with North and South Korea? One of them you might think of is the US and its role in interacting with North Korea. So Kim Jong-un, the regime in North Korea's current dictator, had a meeting with President Trump. They met at the border between North and South Korea, and that was the first time a president had ever interacted with a North Korean dictator. Some might say that there's progress being made between North and South Korea. Others might say there isn't. But nonetheless, remember, there was never a treaty that was signed, only a ceasefire. So there's still a conflict going on. When it comes to the Korean War, it's not something I could tell you who won because no one really did. It just ended with an agreement that we're both not going to fight each other. And that's where we are today. Both sides looking at each other, waiting for the other side to move. So that will conclude our lesson on the Korean War. We move forward next time, we'll be getting into another conflict dealing with the backdrop of the Cold War. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.